Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to both of you for being here. This is an important issue, and I think it's important to remember that anytime we're talking about speech, when someone brings up hate speech, there is a difference, of course, between what could lawfully be prohibited if we were talking about a government prohibition on speech on the one hand, and speech that someone hates on the other hand. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Potts. Can you tell me, Facebook has a different standard for content generated by a user who is not a paid advertiser versus paid advertisements, is that right?
That's correct, Senator. Our content policies apply to all user-generated content. That's the community standards. That is the baseline. For advertisers, there are more stringent standards that sit on top of, of those policies.
And the reason for that is you're being paid for that content and you feel a responsibility to moderate that content to a greater degree. Is that roughly accurate? Okay. Are you familiar with an instance a few months ago in which Susan B. Anthony list, a topic that came up in a slightly different context a few minutes ago, ran a couple of ads dealing with two prematurely born babies who survived, Charlotte Ryan and Micah Pickering?
Yes, Senator, I'm definitely familiar with the Micah Pickering example, maybe a little less so with the Charlotte Ryan.
Okay, so let's go with the Micah Pickering example. I met Micah Pickering. He's a healthy, happy little boy now. His images were featured in an advertisement purchased by the Susan B. Anthony list in order to promote life, in order to promote the idea that children, even children born very prematurely, in the range of 20 to 22 gestational weeks, can still survive and go on to live as happy, healthy human beings. And as I recall, that advertisement was taken down by Facebook. Is that?
That's correct, and I believe that we reinstated that advertisement within 24 hours.
Okay. At the time, what was Facebook's explanation for why it was taken down?
I think it violated one of our advertising policies.
Which policy would that have been?
I believe it was around, we have a policy around somewhat graphic content, and someone viewed that to be graphic. I think the exact name is the sensationalism policy. Senator.
Okay, graphic content, perhaps because it involved a medical procedure, or perhaps because it depicted an infant in a position in which the infant had tubes going into it or something like that.
It is a medical procedure.
Okay, the medical procedure going on, that's depicted and that's regarded as graphic. Does your policy work even-handedly, such that regardless of whether we're talking about pro-life versus pro-choice, what if the same image were depicted in a slightly different context, not advertising perhaps a pro-choice cause, but just another cause unrelated to pro-life? For example, what if that same image of Micah Pickering, or series of images, had been used in the context of an advertisement designed to focus on the dangers associated with drug abuse by a mother carrying a child?
Thank you, Senator. If it was the same picture, I'm assuming that the same policy would have been applied, hopefully the same way. We would like consistency there. As you know, that if there are different pictures, that would perhaps force either the automation and or the reviewer to make it come to a different decision. So if a child is viewed that is 20 weeks maybe versus 24 weeks, I know that's very narrow. For the reviewer, it may be different, but if the policy,
surely the reviewer is not going to be able to differentiate between 22 and 24 weeks. Surely that's not going to make the distinction.
I don't want to try to get too nuanced there, but depending on if the view was that this was too graphic, and I think because of the image which I recall, that decision was made, although it was made incorrectly, to disallow the ad.
But in fact, Mr. Potts, this is not hypothetical, is it? I mean, this has happened. We did, in fact, see the Susan B. Anthony list advertisement taken down, while we had corresponding images used in advertisements that have not been taken down. Isn't that right?
We have, but again, I don't think we've had the same image used.
Okay.
That's
perhaps not the same image,
right,
but an image of an infant in a comparably vulnerable position.
And I think it all, in Senator, I think it all turns on the word comparably. I think they were similar images, but not the same image, so it makes the comparison a bit more difficult. But if they were the same image, I would expect them to have both been taken down by that same reviewer with a misapplication of our policies.
And what explanation can you provide for me as to why one might have been taken down and the other not? Regardless of whether you say they should have been consistent with Facebook's policy, what might account for why they might receive differential treatment?
Senator, I would like to say that, as we mentioned, we review billions of posts and other pieces of content. Sometimes we make mistakes. In this case of this reviewer that reviewed that piece of content with Micah, he removed it incorrectly, or he or she removed it incorrectly. If that's the case, I would expect that reviewer to make the same mistake, regardless of who shared that image. Now, if we take a different image run by the SBA, run by anyone, and place it there, and if that person were to allow it, I assume that they would allow it across the board as well. I don't know if I'm doing a great job of explaining that, but I'm...
No, I think I understand what you're suggesting, and I understand and appreciate the point. Could it not also have to do with other factors, including possibly who is more likely to complain about the Susan B. Anthony image? Who is more likely to work at Facebook? Could that have something to do with it?
I don't believe so, Senator. I think to a question of whether someone would try to influence a decision with their bias, that's something that we really try to exclude, to bring out of the process, to check any type of bias at the door. We have a very strong managing bias curriculum within the company. It's a rigorous program. I've never been in a position where I've written a policy or made an enforcement decision or sat with a product team building an engineering product where someone asked anyone's political affiliation or whether they were pro-life or pro-choice. Again, this one seems like a mistake that I would expect it to have been made no matter who posted it.
Okay. The chair has politely and gently reminded me that I'm over my time limit. I'm going to want to get back to this later and got to go cast a vote. I do think it's worth mentioning here that it is something I consider a mathematical impossibility that there isn't a subjective component to this that involves who is reviewing it. You can't entirely mechanize this. You can't program it into an AI feature to monitor this. It seems to me mathematically impossible to suggest that there isn't some subjective judgment calling going on, and that some of that might not be impacted by who works there. Now, Facebook is a private company. I differ from some of my colleagues in the approach I take to this. I don't view you as a public utility. I don't view you as being owned by the government. But some of my colleagues see it differently, and so it's why it's important for us to flag this. As long as some of my colleagues see it that way, I think this is something that your company ought to focus on and ought to try to work to resolve. We'll get back to that later. Thank you, Madam Chair.